When I was growing up, my family had DVD players built into the back of our headrests. This meant that on every car ride longer than 2 hours, my siblings and I were allowed to watch a movie together in the back seat, and our parents could focus on not crashing the car out of a desperate plea to end our ceaseless bickering. And because we had a specific case of kids' movies for the road, there are still some films that I can't help but associate with these car rides. Ratatouille, The Secret of NIMH, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron, The Aristocats. Honestly, it would feel weird to watch any of these without a seatbelt on. All of this is to say that one of our DVDs had an extremely memorable trailer for the Disney film Dinosaur, which is basically a 10-minute short film that followed the perilous journey of an egg separated from its family after a terrifying carnotaur attack. It was awesome! And hardly even counts as the trailer, because it's basically just the full uncut beginning of the film with a cliffhanger and a title card slapped at the end. Despite looking forward to this trailer every time we popped Tarzan into the disc player, I had never actually seen the film. We never owned it on VHS or DVD. It never played on the Disney Channel. None of my friends have it. We didn't even talk about it at school. Apart from this one vivid childhood tradition, I never had a reason to be in relationship with this film. It was never on anyone's mind. When I set out to make this video series, working my way through the Disney 2000s animated film catalog to explain why this decade of movies is so underrated, I knew I was going to have to start with 2 films I had never seen. The first was Fantasia 2000, which I actually found remarkably foundational to this whole experiment, full video by clicking the card in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. But Dinosaur I really only knew through its reputation as the most forgettable Disney film, maybe apart from the World War II stuff. But again, to my surprise, after watching this film, I don't understand why it garnered such a universally apathetic legacy. It's no one's least favorite movie, but even self-proclaimed Disney fanatics sometimes have to be reminded that it even exists. So why? What is so wrong with this movie that it's basically faded into obscurity? Is it that bad? Am I wrong for thinking maybe it's not such a terrible film after all? No, I don't think so. So, Dinosaur is a confusing addition to the Disney animated film catalog because much of the film is not actually animated, but also a lot of it is. Shots throughout the film were created with a combination of live footage, digital subjects, and then both visual and special effects composited in hundreds of layers in order to evoke prehistoric times. I think if this film were to come out today, it would be considered a similar medium to Disney's live-action remakes of The Jungle Book or The Lion King, where the photorealism aesthetic trumps all and we view the CGI as a method of visual effects and not a medium of animation. I don't think this is a good distinction, but it is how movies with digital characters in real environments have been advertised over the last 10 years. What even is a live-action movie if more than 50% of the elements in any given shot are digitally created? And the line has only gotten blurrier as technology improves. And technically, even when Dinosaur was released in 2000, it was only partially produced by Walt Disney Animation Studios. Much of the visual work was actually done by the Secret Lab, another division of Disney Productions that focused on digital art effects and composition. The Secret Lab was shut down in 2005 and didn't really produce much work besides occasional visual effects for films like The Princess Diaries and Kangaroo Jack.
Nice!
And Dinosaur was really their only extensive CG feature of note. But because it was only partially produced by the company's animation studio, when Dinosaur was released, it wasn't really marketed as part of the company's official animation lineup. Think about a film like Planes, which was not produced by Walt Disney Animation Studios, but by Disney Toon Studios, another separate but connected division of the larger company. So on any official Disney catalog, Planes rarely makes the cut. And neither do films like A Goofy Movie, Tinkerbell, or Lion King 1.5.
What was that?
Not as a judgment of quality, but because a different studio made them. Because of the studio confusion with the Secret Lab, Dinosaur was in a similar boat until 2010 with the release of a completely different animated film, Tangled, which of course was a huge marketing tool used to launch a new era of films and return the company to its pre-millennium financial glory days. And part of the ad campaign for Tangled was marketing it as Disney's 50th animated film, which was only technically true if Dinosaur counted too. All of which is to say that if you're feeling bad about not remembering this film as a beloved animated classic, you really shouldn't. It's only been on the list for the last 14 years. But with all of that confusion out of the way, what is Dinosaur? Who did make it? Where did it come from? Well, the film was directed by Eric Layton and Ralph Zondag. both of which are names that I would be surprised if you'd heard before, but had and have continued to work in animation since the early 90s. Much like the name would suggest, the film takes place about 65 million years ago and follows a group of dinosaurs living in a minor post-apocalypse. Specifically, we follow an iguanodon named Aladar, who was separated from his birth family as an egg and instead raised on a remote island by a colony of lemurs. Having no connection to other dinosaurs, let alone other iguanodons, Aladar grows up feeling a little bit like an outcast, but also grows a strong emotional attachment to his adoptive family. But when a meteor hits Earth and destroys their island, Aladar and his family flee to the mainland, where they encounter a mass migration of other dinosaurs who are seeking sanctuary in their nesting grounds. Since minor apocalypses are scary, you might as well have a road trip. This diverse group is led by another iguanodon named Kron, who believes in a strict and stubborn survival of the fittest mindset.
We stop for nothing, and no one.
Kron genuinely wants to lead his group to safety, but also believes that only the physically strong deserve to get there.
If we keep going like this, we'll lose half the herd.
Then we save the half that deserves to live.
A cruel ideology that Aladar fundamentally doesn't understand. And because of their outsider status, Aladar and his family are stigmatized by the other dinosaurs, only befriending a handful of other outcasts who have trouble keeping up with Kron's brutal pace for the herd.
We can hardly keep up. An older woman like myself, it's positively indecent.
On this journey, Aladar advocates for the weaker members of the group and attempts to show Kron the value in life and wisdom beyond strength. And there are cool dinosaur fights thrown in every now and again. The whole movie is basically a prolonged chase sequence between the herd and a pair of carnivores looking to eat them. That's pretty much the plot of Dinosaur. The film came out on May 19th, 2000, two pretty good reviews, mostly praising the film's groundbreaking effects rather than its characters or story. Unlike Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur started with a wide release in over 3,200 theaters and performed #1 at the box office during its premiere weekend, and stayed in the top 5 for about a month. So with a budget of about $127 million, Dinosaur easily made that back domestically and did well overseas, with a total global box office of about $350 million. It was the 9th highest grossing film in 2002 behind other titles like How the Grinch Stole Christmas, X-Men, Mission Impossible 2, and Gladiator. Overall, the film did pretty well, especially for being the experimental project of a lesser studio under the Disney brand, which I think is contradictory to how people remember the film now, or rather, don't remember it at all. Since it has such a reputation as a blip in the Disney timeline, conversations I've had with folks, even diehard Disney fans, often involve reminding them that this film was in no way financially unsuccessful. In terms of box office numbers, Dinosaur did not flop. In terms of cultural impact, especially 24 years later, well, that's another story. I mean, I guarantee that someone watching this video right now has been on the dinosaur ride at Animal Kingdom and not realized that it was a movie tie-in. I mean, I haven't, but that's mostly because I'm a wimp and I think the drop in Pirates of the Caribbean is a bit much. Now, I have a couple theories as to why this movie isn't beloved. And from those conversations I've had with real people and the general chatter I've observed on the internet death arena of public consciousness, I think there are two main criticisms that get thrown around more than others. Number one, the CGI is dated. The film looks like it came out 24 years ago, and the visual effects don't hold up to a modern standard of appreciation. And number two, the story is boring. Now, I don't entirely disagree with either of these statements, but I also don't think that they're a helpful way of looking at this film's legacy. And in some ways, in my personal opinion, it doesn't matter. And by that I mean, you're wrong if you think this film looks bad and has nothing to say. Because it does, and it's a cyclical problem. If Dinosaur had a greater impact, then it would be better remembered. Because that's how we process media through cultural osmosis. We draw meaning from shared conversations and experience. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because I want to talk about the visuals first. I think my least favorite criticism of films I watched in my childhood is that the CGI sucks. Because sure, maybe, but as a kid, I had no concept of bad CGI. In fact, up until maybe middle school, my eyes literally could not distinguish between elements in a digital composition that were computer generated and hand drawn. And not just when they were blended well. For example, a couple years ago, I was rewatching Spirit, the Matt Damon horse movie, and to my surprise, Not only was there CGI in the film, but I could clearly tell where it was. Through adult eyes, the difference in medium, often in the same shot, was glaring. Like in the train sequence, at some point between my childhood and right now, I developed the ability to see that Spirit himself and the train were not created the same. Or the chains, or some of the camera movements. I think we get stuck in this mindset when criticizing CGI, where we're so concerned with photorealism that we forget that that's only one measure of quality. For example, the animation in Toy Story 4 looks much more realistic than the original Toy Story, meaning that the texturing is better, and the motion graphics, and the light ray scattering, and oh my gosh, look at the hair on this cat! Every technology that exists in order to make a digital model look as close as possible to a physical object captured on film improved between these two movies. Does that mean that this movie has inherently better visuals? I mean, Toy Story was the first CGI feature animated film. It was literally the ground floor for what the industry would become. Does that mean it has the worst CGI of any Pixar film? By that narrow definition, yes. I mean, this certainly looks less like a dog than the cat did, and that certainly doesn't look like a baby. In a story about toys, it makes sense that the goal is to recreate the feel and look of playing with wood and plastic as realistically as possible. But on the other hand, some of my favorite animated films are not particularly concerned with realism. The Spider-Verse movies, Mitchells vs. the Machines, Puss in Boots and The Last Wish, these are all films with a unique visual style all their own. They have no pretense of trying to render an image that will convince you it was shot on film. And they use techniques that are not possible in real life in order to create rhetorical meaning in an animated medium. This is good CGI that doesn't look anything like photorealism. But when we hear about bad CGI, the conversation is usually about live-action movies. And I'm not going to claim that poor quality CGI doesn't exist. Like, there's a reason no one's ever going to let The Rock forget about his role as the Scorpion King in The Mummy Returns. And awards won in visual effects every year are usually deserved. As a society, we live to judge art. Even if it's subjective, that doesn't mean that we all can't come to a general consensus in most cases. So no, CGI can be bad, but I want you to redefine what you think that means. Because to me, the only bad CGI is when it's ineffective. Whether they are practical or visual effects, if the goal was to trick the audience into thinking that something was captured organically, then an ineffective effect is one where you see behind the curtain anyway. Maybe the computer model glitches, or the green screen looks funny, or the motion paths weren't tracked correctly. If something about the CGI looks particularly fake, it's probably going to draw you out of the scene and remind you that you're watching a film. These involuntary breaks in our suspension of disbelief often undermine their emotional impact. Is there any danger from a goofy-looking monster? And this is a particularly common issue for live-action films because CGI in live-action films is almost exclusively used to imitate life. But I'd argue that it's actually a more complex conversation when it comes to the intentionally animated space. Is the existential horror of seeing baby Molly Davis going to distract you from the rest of the scene? Yeah, probably. But finally, drawing this tangent closer to prehistoric times, consider Pixar's much later 2015 animated film, The Good Dinosaur, which, even though it's been almost a decade now, still contains some of the most photorealistic animation that any studio has ever released. And these goofy-looking character models. There's a fundamental disconnect between the natural environments shown throughout the film with such technical precision that closely imitates life, and the blobby cartoon dinosaurs that populate it. Arlo doesn't look like he belongs in his own movie, and to me, that is a systematic problem with the design concept in the movie. And a clear example of ineffective CGI that pulls you out of the moment. So, Disney's Dinosaur. I don't dislike the animation in this film, but I will recognize that if it was released today, it would probably look more realistic. We just have better technology to produce the same effects that the original filmmakers were going for. Things like texture, lighting, rendering. There is a hypothetical version of this film that is indistinguishable from life. However, I don't want that. Take the 2019 Lion King film, for example, something that was trying so hard to be exactly this, an animated film with CGI so realistic you could not tell if any of it was shot on film. But, as it's been pointed out by pretty much every online reviewer, real lions don't emote, and the emotional beats of the story suffer. Going back to the Spirit example, one of the most famous design choices in that film was giving the horse characters eyebrows, even though horses don't have eyebrows. but this was an easy way for the animators to show more human emotion on the animals, which is incredibly important for a film with minimal dialogue. So with these live-action animated films, it's kind of the opposite problem of The Good Dinosaur, because the character models need to walk this fine line of anthropomorphism, where they look like they fit into the world that they inhabit, but you can still tell what they're feeling from a quick glance. And yes, while things like the skin texturing could be better, I do think that a film that manages to balance the human and animal characteristics really well is Dinosaur. Compare the scenes where Simba watches his father die and Aladar faces down the Carnotaur against Kron's orders. Both of these entirely CGI characters are in acute emotional distress, but I'd argue that only one of them looks like it. And there's nuance in Aladar's expressions. In a split second, you can tell that he's scared, concerned for Nira, annoyed with Kron, and ultimately brave enough to face death head on. This is not ineffective CGI. It might look rough, it might look 20 years old, and it might not be your personal cup of tea, but this is a well-designed film. Also, apart from the CGI conversation, the other visuals in this film are stunning. Here are 2 words for your beginner's cinematography vocab pack: mise-en-scène and tableau. Or tableau if you're feeling really insulting to French people. Both of these have to do with shot composition and the visual language of film. Mise-en-scène is a term borrowed from the world of theater and literally translates to set the scene. Basically, it's a term for what was physically on the stage. So things like lighting, set dressing, costume, props, etc. But not camera movements, editing, or other aspects of filmmaking rhetoric that don't have a physical presence in the shot. A tableau is a more specific type of scene that you can think of like a frozen picture or a snapshot in time. Something like Da Vinci's famous Last Supper painting, or dogs playing poker. In similar film terms, a tableau is the arrangement of actors and other on-screen elements in order to create narrative meaning in the frame. For instance, here is a baby, here is a cliff. By putting these elements in proximity to each other on screen, I have created narrative tension in one image. Then, of course, the best tableaus also carry some amount of aesthetic beauty, or at least these are the ones that stick out to me when I'm watching a film. And what stuck out to me while watching Dinosaur was how gorgeous the cinematography was throughout the movie, especially when it came to shot composition and using single frames to unpack rich moments in action, plot, and emotional story. With each new location, the film does an excellent job of establishing tone and atmosphere just through its carefully arranged visual elements. And let me tell you, everything in this film had to be carefully arranged. I mentioned before that this film was created with a combination of live-action footage, visual effects, special effects, and digital character models. This means that every single shot in the movie is a composite of dozens, if not hundreds, of elements and layers combined to create a single frame. This is why the film was so heavily praised for its groundbreaking visual effects. A film like this had yet to exist at this caliber at the time. I'm not going to linger too long in this section because how many times can I actually say, wow, that shot looked really cool, or ooh, how pretty? But these are some of the standouts for me. I'll also mention here that the action and fight sequences are all really clear and well shot in this film. And I've heard the complaint before that folks initially liked the movie and the silent beginning and, the egg journey, and then didn't like the movie when they realized that the dinosaurs could talk and that they would continue to talk for the rest of the runtime. But to be honest, this film isn't afraid of letting the visuals speak for themselves. There are fairly long sequences of action and sometimes not action where the dialogue entirely drops out and the story is maintained through models, editing, and shot composition. And the insistence that this same story could be told without dialogue at all seems a little far-fetched to me, unless you weren't paying attention to how nuanced the film's message actually is. While discussing the 1997 film Gattaca, a far more obvious example of anti-eugenics cinema, David Kirby gives a brief definition of the term in his essay, The New Eugenics in Cinema, Genetic Determinism and Gene Therapy in Gattaca. Kirby writes that eugenics may be defined as any attempt to accelerate human evolution by improving the genetic makeup of humans, impelled in a specific direction by human intervention. In Gattaca, the plot revolves around gene replacement therapy, in a world where babies can be wholly designed before their birth.
You want to give your child the best possible start. Believe me, we have enough imperfection built in already.
Things like predispositions for cancers, cognitive disorders, and heart problems are supposedly eliminated in order to better society as a whole. This, of course, only applies to the upper classes that can afford it. But when only desirable traits are allowed to thrive, at what point do we draw the line so that we don't breed out humanity in the quest to better it? No one wants the genes that grow cancer, but what about nearsightedness? Or hearing loss, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, colorblindness, red hair? Kirby quotes another academic named Jeremy Rifkin in saying, "What is to preclude a society from deciding that a certain skin color is a disorder?" This critique in Gattaca results in a dystopian film that examines our biases when it comes to discussions of disability, wealth, and ethics. And it is perhaps the most famous film that unpacks the evils of eugenics that still plague the scientific community today. Now, and here's where I think Disney's critics missed the point, because 3 years later, Dinosaur premiered with a very similar message. Or at least it's concerned with the same idea. Crone's obsession with the herd survival leads him to view his people in terms of strength and weakness, where physical ability is the highest virtue, and he doesn't even see all physical strength as equal. Baleen is one of the only dinosaurs strong enough to break through the mud to find water in the dried-up canyon. But Kron still relegates her as an outcast because she's older and slower than the majority of the herd, meaning that she's less useful to him most of the time. And if you're still not seeing the Gattaca parallels here, think about where the herd is going. What is the sanctuary at the end of their journey? The nesting grounds.
I heard you say something about nesting grounds.
Kron is leading who he deems are the strongest members of society in order to repopulate a shaken world after major disaster, so that undesirable traits are bred out and only the fittest survive.
If we keep going like this, we'll lose half the herd.
Then we save the half that deserves to live.
Eugenics is an awful, evil ideology. It is entirely based on racist and ableist propaganda that has contributed to centuries of discrimination, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. It is a heavy topic to cover, loaded with grief and generational trauma, but it's also an important lesson for children to hear refuted early, because otherwise we're fed the opposite. There are a plethora of movies where characters with disabilities are the villains, or where goodness and a particularly desirable genetic trait are conflated. There are less movies about equity, not equality, equity. Crone expects everyone in his herd to move at exactly the pace that he can. He's not giving special treatment to anyone. He's treating them all equally. But characters like Baleen and Ema fall through the cracks in a society designed to weed them out, to eliminate them through apathy rather than aggression. What Dinosaur does so well is portraying nuance and disability, and in age-appropriate terms, explaining why eugenics is both cruel and ineffective. For example, all the members of the herd who Aladar befriends also serve as another allegory for a way that society discriminates against minority communities. Ema and Baleen are elderly and therefore slower and tire more easily. Aladar's lemur family are treated as outcasts for not being dinosaurs. I mean, it's not like a great allegory for racism, but certainly some degree of xenophobia.
What an unfortunate blemish.
Good mud bath will clear those right up.
Excuse me.
And then there's Earl, who behaves more like what the audience would perceive as a dog rather than an anthropomorphized dinosaur. This, I think, is the filmmaker's attempt at addressing cognitive disorders or learning disabilities, and while it's not like great representation, it's in the movie. All of the characters, but especially Aladar and his family, are refugees. And maybe my favorite way that the film addresses disability is through the character of Bruton, aka Kron's right-hand man. But in a fight on a scouting mission, Bruton is brutally injured, cast out by Kron, and left to die from his wounds.
You led them right to us. Maybe you can feed them with your hide.
What's nuanced about this depiction of physical disability is that we have a character who's forced to confront and work through their own internalized ableism. Because he wasn't born disabled, Bruton has intense biases that lead him into deep depression when he loses what he perceives as inherently desirable traits. He is wrong, and the movie makes that clear. Aladar helps him gain perspective on the value of life, and even though he does end up sacrificing himself a few minutes later, he does so not out of self-destructive hopelessness, but the same heroicism that led him to fight for friends in the first place. Being injured did not dehumanize him or make him a character that you can sink your pity into. Bruton's character arc had growth right up until the end. There's a great line towards the end of the film where Kron and Aladar are arguing over the fastest way to get to the nesting grounds.
You're gonna kill the herd! I know a way to the valley, and everybody can make it! Now follow me!
Kron wants to scale a steep cliff, not knowing that there's a deadly drop on the other side that will most likely kill most of his herd, if they can make the climb at all. Aladar wants to go the long way around through the caves that will bring everyone to safety. It'll just take a little more time. Like repairing a wheelchair ramp before a staircase, prioritizing accessibility benefits everyone. The fittest don't need to prove it to survive. The message of this movie is really clear, but that doesn't make it overly simple. I would agree that the story is not the highlight of Dinosaur. It's a film that heavily leans on its visuals to carry the experience. But especially in the early 2000s media landscape, I respect this movie for tackling a heavy topic with an attempt at nuance. And it is a shame that apparently the message didn't land. I enjoyed Dinosaur far more than I intended to. It's not the greatest Disney film, it's not the most underrated, not even in the same year, but having never bothered to see it, everything I knew through the film's reputation proved untrue, or at least greatly exaggerated. The CGI is not as bad as you remember, the rest of the visuals are much better, the film never flopped at the box office, and while there are undeniable similarities, like both films have dinosaurs in them, this is not just Disney's ripoff of The Land Before Time, and instead has a wonderful message for both children and adults on what it means to value life and humanity as more than how it can serve you. So I do recommend watching it. And if you liked this video, thank you! Would you like some more? You can subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your thoughts on Dinosaur, its reputation, and whether or not you think that Toy Story has bad CGI. Hot takes only. You can also tell me your favorite dinosaur. This video is part of a larger video series where I am going through every Disney modern age film to explain why this era of movies was so underrated. So keep your eyes tuned for the next one because we are just getting started. You can follow us on Twitter at Theory_Central and consider supporting us on Patreon like the incredible David W., Alex Quinto, and Byron Childs. If our patrons are dinosaurs, they would be brontosauruses because sometimes I still can't tell if they're even real. But that's all I have for you today, so thanks for watching. You still could not pay me to ride the dinosaur ride in Animal Kingdom, and I'll see you later.
Not bad. But I don't get it.